Leviticus 16 through 20. Continuing our discussion on the book of Leviticus as a whole. In fact, let's pick up where we left off last time with the question, how can a righteous person approach the holy home of his God, of Yahweh, in the land of Israel? The question of the problem that we have to solve is a good one, and I'd like to quote from a standard seminary or Bible college textbook to give a sample of what has been said in times past. The book of Leviticus teaches that God is separate from the present world and that only those who are freed from the taint of sin are permitted into his presence. Another sentence, God is holy and cannot tolerate the presence of sin. Those are fine statements, but for the sake of being clear, I'd like to explain how I differ a little bit from how that is said, because that could give the misimpression that the reason God can't be with us is simply because of sin generally. The reason I think we need to clarify is because, remember, the issue that we saw earlier in Leviticus is this word chata in Hebrew, often translated as sin. But the kind of sins that were described in Leviticus 4 through 15, if you remember, like touching a carcass or having a bodily discharge, those kind of issues, what it caused was a person to become ritually impure. In other words, it wasn't sin in general that caused a person to be unable to go to the tabernacle. It was a kind of sin. In fact, it's called several times non-rebellious or inadvertent sin. It means that your hand isn't, shaking up at God and saying, I don't like you, or I don't want to worship you. It's the kinds of sins that cause you to become impure, but it's not morally reprehensible. That's a very fine line, but it is drawn there carefully in those chapters of Leviticus 4 through 15. So, to be consistent with the story of how the Bible is both treating a person as righteous because of his worship, and now not making that person able to go into the tabernacle because of their impurity, watch how the Bible then gives a ritualistic solution to a ritualistic problem. Here comes the sacrifices that we have been reading about in Leviticus. In fact, the words atone or atonement and forgive and forgiven are used, 10 times in the book of Leviticus. These two words appear in the same verse as though they're synonymous ideas. The last time they're mentioned together is in our reading today, 19:22. You can take a look at that. So what causes, again, a person to become impure now with this process of sacrifice allows him to be cleansed or to be ritually pure so that they can walk in, as it were, to God's presence. Now, lest we think this is just some kind of a mechanical idea, there was a process that people went through that was more than this to actually go through this, and let's go through the ideas here. After a person would sin in the way that caused them to become impure, they were required or asked to repent. In other words, simply admit what happened. For instance, the farmer who touches the carcass admits what happened. Then they were to make restitution. Now, of course, in the case of a carcass, there wasn't one, but sometimes, depending on what you did, you had to pay 20% to a person of what you had taken or something like that. This, by the way, shows that the sacrifice itself was not considered payment. It wasn't considered substitution. That's taken care of separately as a separate step. Well, then a person was cleansed, and I'm going to put that in quotes because that is going to come up here as a ritualistic issue later. Then the sacrifice proper was done, the animal was killed, or the grain was burnt, or whatever the sacrifice required, and then as a last step, there was an acceptance of the person back into society, as though the reset button was hit. And here then, the reason I put those in quotes is because this is where these two words that we are so used to using, even in our modern Christian discussion, here's where these words come into play. The cleansing was called atonement. The Hebrew word kafar means to cover or to cleanse. And the acceptance idea is where that word in the book of Leviticus, forgive, is used. We often think of forgive, again, in English, as though God has a moral standard that has been broken, and he forgives in the official sense like a judge. But in the book of Leviticus, it's part of a process of having sinned or become ritually impure. You go through a process, and now you go back, and again, think of the farmer goes back to his field and probably repeats this process the next week when he touches another carcass. So that's the story then of atonement and forgiveness in the book of Leviticus. Notice again, impurity is cleansed so that you can be in a pure, holy place that is God's house.